Welcome to Better Leaders, the podcast, where we surface good leadership and smart management in media and beyond. Today, I'm talking to Irving Washington, Senior Fellow at the Kaiser Family Foundation. My name is Anita Zilina, and I'm your host. Welcome to Better Leaders. Irving, I'm super excited to have you here in the podcast today. Thanks for joining.
Glad to be here, Anita.
So why don't we start? I'm sure many in our audience do know you, but why don't we start by you giving just a little kind of intro into who you are, what you're doing, and the career path that basically took you here?
Sure. What I'm currently doing today for work to preference that, I am currently a senior fellow at KFF, which was formerly known as the Kaiser Family Foundation. And I am exploring all things at the intersection of health, misinformation, and trust, with the goal that we would have a new program area at KFF focused on this. My background has been within a very unique niche of media and nonprofits. And by that, specifically associations, media associations. So I was the former CEO of the Online News Association. I was there for 11 years. I've also worked for the National Association of Black Journalists, the Radio, Television, Digital News Association now, and more alphabet soups that I will not go. But if there is a media association, I've likely intersected with it at some point in time.
So let's maybe start with the obvious question, or at least I think it's an obvious question for a young generation where the average tenure in organizations is like 2.1 or 2.4 years or something. 11 years as CEO of ONA. That is a long time. Like, what made you stay there for such a long time? And when did you kind of, decide it's time to move on?
It's so funny. People have said that quite a bit. And I also think things are relative. For example, my mother, who she works in insurance, she's literally had the same job since I've been born. So I won't date myself, but I will say that spans 4 decades.
Wow.
And so I look at that and say, that is quite a long tenure. So when we look at 11, I think I haven't even scratched the surface. But also just, again, generationally, what is considered a long time. I can't remember where I heard this, but it was around recreating, reinventing, doing something new every 2 years. And so I was CEO for 6 years. And then prior to that, I had different elevations at ONA. I started as a consultant while I was working full time at NAPJ. Some people know that, some people don't. And I think this also plays into leadership too. So prior to me being CEO, Jane McDonald, who was the CEO at the time, also found different leadership opportunities for me. Again, not just doing me a favor. It was what the organization actually needed and the timing worked out. So around every 2-ish years, I was doing something different. And to that point, even to the role directly, 2 roles prior to being the CEO, I was the director of operations. And that stemmed from me intentionally wanting to do something that I had never done before, which was actually manage the operations of an organization. I was able to go to Jane with that and say, this is a skill set that I would like to develop. And we were able to work something out. So that's how I ended up being there for so long, because every few years it was a new job. And then even in the CEO role, if you notice that span of 6 years around 2017 to 2022, 2020 falls dead in the middle of that. And my job prior to 2020 to post 2020 was completely different. And to add one more pin on that, I started in 2017, which is immediately after 2016, which is a pivotal moment within journalism at large, but specifically in the US. So there were these very pivotal moments happening over the course of those 11 years.
Totally. And it was never, that's where we intersected, when I was on the ONA board. And I think one thing that one can definitely say is it wasn't boring, right? It's not like leading a journalism association ever got boring in the past 10-ish years, right? Because you basically had to reinvent the organization, reinvent, how you deal with crises of all kinds several times throughout the past 10 or so years, right?
Yes, and not only that, this is what I don't know if everyone needs to work at an association, but you definitely should get involved because one of the unique things about this particular kind of work, in addition to staff that your coworkers that you work with who are obviously paid members from the organization, you're spending a significant amount of your time working with volunteer members who have full-time jobs elsewhere, and your entire function of your job is dependent upon working with all of these incredible folks. But again, this is what they're doing as their extracurricular activity and volunteering. So you're going through these transformational changes in an organization, in an industry, not just with the people who you are co-workers with through a paid function of your organization, but with this whole host of volunteers. And that just adds such a layer and a dynamic that teachers do a lot.
Totally. And I mean, I think no CEO who signs up for a CEO job kind of expects to have a close to dictatorship in, their own country and, the first global health crisis, aka first global pandemic we all had to live through, the, murder of George Floyd and the racial reckoning or not reckoning that's happening related to that. So, I mean, you had like multi-crisis, I feel like, to manage. The lack of trust in journalism, the decline in trust, fake news and kind of influencing hackers trying to hack journalism organizations. Did you ever at one point of these like multi-crises, were you ever like, why did I kind of raise my hand for this? Why did I sign up for this?
Both two moments happen on opposite ends of the spectrums of that. In the opposite of what you just said as to why would I sign my hand up for this, 2020 was actually affirming for me. And if you notice now, and I think I've seen you talk about this too, what we formerly, I think, referred to as soft skills now, if you are reading anything or if you're seeing the moments of when people were able to kind of have full leadership on display, it was people who had a strong sense of, again, I formerly call them soft skills, but they are pure leadership skills. So how well were you in tune to your staff and people? How were you developing the culture of your organization? All of these things that weren't necessarily they were talked about, but it was nice to have. It really was about, the bottom line at the end of the day. What major initiatives were you doing? It was all of these sort of outcome focused specific things. And I felt like 2020 was a moment where people who did not understand that there is a holistic human being in your care were falling by the wayside left and right in terms of their leadership. And they really struggled. And I think, again, it sort of clicked for me, all of the things that I don't think were its value before. Prior to that moment, it was a chance for me to excel. On the flip side of that, the moment I think that was more challenging, and it's like, why am I in this role? And it was even really beyond the role. You mentioned the murder of George Floyd and being a Black leader, a Black male leader at that. Part of why you get to this job is you figure things out. You know how to get things done. You display leadership in a time of leadership. You display vulnerability at the appropriate time. There's all these things that I had excelled at. And that was the moment where I had no energy to give. And I had to admit that and had to publicly, and you were on the board at the time, just send a note and just be very transparent and say, I don't have 100% to give right now. And I just want to be transparent about that. And this is how we're working around it. But for someone who prides themselves on sort of strong leadership and being there for other people, it was a moment, again, that was humbling now for me that I can look at in retrospect. But at the time, that was a pretty difficult moment.
Which I can absolutely imagine. But if I reflect on that back now, I think it was actually you're saying, like, you're used to being the strong leader and strong leaders don't do that. But I actually think that is exactly what strong leaders do, right? Being that level of self-reflected, that they understand when their own resilience, kind of suffers, or when they are at a point where they have to kind of take a step back and take a deep breath. And I think you sharing that so transparently with the board, and I assume also with, the staff in the organization, I think did something to the board and to the organization where suddenly others felt empowered to say, well, I might not be exactly in your shoes. I might not be a person of color, or I might not be from the US, but I can now feel more comfortable sharing about what's been on my mind. So I think it kind of created this momentum of transparency in the organization?
Oh, in retrospect, I can definitely see that in the moment and beyond just dealing with the things that I was dealing with personally and sort of processing all of that. It did feel like, why am I in this role? Also from a place of, quite frankly, it felt, despite having sort of the influence and the stature of being with the CEO role, it also was a very helpless moment.
Yeah.
Where, I was given all this, I felt like I was given all this privilege and opportunity, but at the time, certain periods, it felt like I can't do anything in this moment despite that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there is a certain helplessness to some situations where, where there is this feeling of, even with all the power that comes with a leadership role, sadly, one cannot change the world. I don't know if you had that experience, but I feel like as I climbed kind of the career ladder, I think very early on I had this stupid idea that the higher you climb, the easier it will be to get the things that you want to get. And then I realized at some point, I'm like, oh, this is going to happen when I'm, at the VP level, at the C level. And I'm like, oh no, actually, some things do become easier when you kind of, have the fiat power to just make decisions or spend money. But it's not like you suddenly get all you want from life and the world and your organization once you reach C level, right?
100%. Prior to 2020, coincidentally, I went and still am on this journey. I think I call myself a de facto happiness researcher because everything you just described, I also had experienced, and I was looking for answers around it. And it wasn't just me personally. I think I was noticing that organizationally, not just my organization, but other organizations, there's this constant search for the next thing and the grind, and not even grind how people describe it as the sort of hustle culture grind, but there, even when a manageable schedule, there's the grind to do the next thing, both in people and organizations. And I think for me, what I reflected on is there was very few opportunities just to rest in the moment of celebration and success of something, because you had to immediately go on the next thing, because the next thing was what's going to make you quote unquote happy. And again, I'm using that loosely in organizational terms, but it's the same sort of journey. Like you're looking for the thing that's going to make you more successful, more happy, both personally and in the organization.
So what did you find out in your kind of pursuit of happiness and your happiness and leadership research? What are some paths or some practices or some perspectives that you now have that kind of help you see that differently or approach it more intentionally, maybe?
There's a lot. I think the one that I make as an overarching thing is that while knowledge is power, it is not action. So even with all of the things that I will tell you that I have learned, this is still sort of a daily struggle and reminder for me. But one thing is our minds, in my opinion, and also I think research kind of shows this, it's a little bit tricky in terms of what you think you want. You really have to sort of separate yourself and interrogate that and figure out how much of what you want, whether it is for you personally or your organization, is environmental. So, for example, we are in a country that prioritizes work and status. When you go to any event, what do people ask you? What do you do? I could have been born in another country where family is the priority. So it's more about, how is your family? Who is your partners or your children or your parents? And so one is recognizing, is the quote unquote grind game path I'm on, do I actually want this, or is my environment telling me that I want? And you have to consistently do it all the time because your environment sort of just kind of takes you. And I think where I've applied that to the organization is a lot of times organizations will sort of be in this competition with each other.
Yeah.
And are you really leading this because this is what you see uniquely where your organization needs to go? Or are you in the grind of, particularly in media, right? Like this station is competing with this station, or this news organization is competing with this station. And no one's really asking the question of like their audiences or who they're kind of serving. The second one overall that I've tried to remember, and you alluded to this, but I think the formal term of that is hedonic adaptation. So if you think about it, I think there's a lot of research around athletes, particularly professional athletes, after they win the gold medal. They go through depression, they go through downtimes because they've spent their entire lives working for this one goal that quote unquote is the utopia moment when everything will be worth it. And I think once you're around long enough and you hit these different milestones, you realize you have sort of this joy in the moment, but you would just get used to whatever that new level is. And then again, if you're not paying attention to your environment, you sort of go to sort of that next thing. So most of it just has to do with awareness and intentionality.
Yeah, such a good point. And I totally agree. So assuming you kind of have that level of awareness and intentionality to kind of design or try to design your career, because obviously it's not always up to us to design our careers. Sometimes there are just opportunities to wait for and whatever. When do you make, like specifically for your case, for example, with O&A, when did you make the decision that next step is something you want to explore? I assume it wasn't like a pure career ladder climbing decision, because I mean, come on, being the CEO of the largest journalism association is pretty, what one of my former interviewees on this podcast, Raju Narizetti, might have called a terminal job. I mean, some other people would be like, I'm going to do this till I retire. And it's great. So can you share a little bit about the kind of decision process about what's next that went through your head?
Yeah, the first thing that when people have asked me about this, and so I've tried to really intentionally think about this, because the advantage that I have today and we have today is always hindsight. And when you tell something from hindsight, there's these nice packaged stories that sound great when you tell someone, but then when you think about when you were in it, this was not actually how this felt. So again, I always put the preference of like, this is sort of the hindsight version.
Yeah.
In the moment of it. It was never sort of one moment. And I think this is what I reflected on overall, and it goes back sort of the intentionality. There is, whether you call it spirituality, discernment, whatever you want to call it, I fundamentally believe there is sort of a driving thing in you that pushes you in different directions. And it's not this knock you upside the head moment. For some people, they do get those moments. I think for the majority of people, there are whispers and moments. And if you're not intentional in the environment, you will completely miss hearing all of that. And so for me, it was a series of whispers and moments over the course of a few years. And it was never this sort of big pull of anything. A couple of things that resonated with me was one, for a long period of time, I never thought about what was after O&A. And so then it became a couple of whispers of like, I wonder what I would do after O&A. A few seconds. I would think a few seconds about it, move on to the next thing. It really wasn't sort of this strong push because I enjoyed where I was. I think sort of the other moments was when, and everyone doesn't have the opportunity to make this, I, again, know what energy level that I bring to different things. And so I think rolling into that last year, I was maybe 3% less. So like, not much. Like it was still things would have been fine. Things were going well for me, and I think the organization, and I could have been there for a long while. But it was just a little bit less. Like this little kind of thing of like, you know what, the energy you would have had for this is just a little bit lower. And so what could that mean? And then from there, I think it was just more exploratory questions around sort of timing.
I think that's a beautiful way to put it. And then when I think about like job decisions that I make or that people surrounding me make, I think sometimes the risk is that you're just like too much in the grind of getting stuff done and in the, daily business with a lot of like noise, like literal noise happening, competition noise, market noise, caring for money noise, people caring for people noise, that you don't hear those whispers and that you don't let these little thoughts like happen in a way.
Yeah.
And I feel that's what, when I think about like career decisions that I made in general, I'm happy with all of the ones I made, but the ones that I made a little bit too late were maybe the ones where it was like so noisy that I didn't hear my own reflections anymore.
A baseline question for me was once I started to feel what I call like a tug of it was time to go. And I don't know if everyone knows this. I did where I am currently, even though the succession of getting this job was pretty short, this opportunity was nowhere near the horizon. I didn't even know this existed. So this decision was an independent decision on its own to sort of leave O&A. But the guiding question for me ultimately was around what would I regret more? Not listening to this, even if, again, it doesn't make sense. Like you said, this is one of those jobs. If you do it well, you can have it for a long time. You have an amazing impact. You're working with amazing people. But what would you regret more? Would you regret not listening to this and never knowing, or listening to this and utterly failing?
Yeah, totally.
And like, wait, I cannot, it would kill me not to know.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's just at some point in your career, like I think the risk assessment, if you want to put it that way, it just becomes more difficult because obviously, specifically when you thrive in a role, specifically when you've built the network, specifically when you manage to kind of, do all the hard things like getting started with stakeholder management and getting kind of, getting the lay of the land if you're in a new industry and all of that stuff. And then you feel like you're there. I think it's in our minds, it just becomes so risky. Like, that the loss aversion, kind of feeling becomes so big. So I think the risk is that many people stay in roles, even though they kind of hear that whisper somehow and feel that tug, but they're like, well, how do I even know that what I'm getting is going to be as good as what I'm losing here?
So the interesting thing about that, when I look at some of the moments in my career that were the most transformational is when I took a risk. Most people don't know that I actually quit NABJ before I got a full-time job at ONA as well. And the thing that I usually would like to add, because I will listen to these podcasts too, and I always will like, well, wait, what's like the extra story here?
Yeah.
There's a baseline where I think everyone has to just go through all of their fears. My fear was not having income and I cannot afford the mortgage or my expenses. And this was years ago. There is a number attached to that.
Yeah.
There's literally a number attached. Okay. What is the worst case scenario that I think that I would be able to not have an income and the likelihood of me getting a job, not just any job, but a job that I wanted? For me, that number was a year.
Yeah.
And so over time, I worked up to making sure, again, there's a lot of things out of your control. This is not for everybody, but I think you have to look at your situation and figure out, just literally play your biggest fear.
Yeah.
And in most cases, there is a number attached or there's something attached to that again, you may not know how it's going to be attainable, but it gives you something to say, hey, if this was actually taken care of, I would be in a little risky move more than what I would be normally.
Yeah. And I think that's such a smart way to think about it because sometimes these decisions feel so big and lofty. And I feel it sometimes is as if you don't have the necessary data to even make those decisions. But I think you can trick your way into kind of making it more data driven and data oriented, right? You can do these things, what you just mentioned, like figure out, what are the 3 bullet points that really need to be in place? What is the worst thing? I mean, that's one thing that I've always asked myself when I took so-called risky decisions, even though they were never risky in the sense of, risking your life or your livelihood or your family's livelihood. But what is really the worst thing that can happen? And for someone who, has reached a certain level in their career, well, how bad is it if you have a few months of, looking for the next thing? Or how bad is it if you go to something else and you just spend a year with something and you're like, well, that was not really it. People keep telling you it's the end of the world, but it's really not, right?
The things that I keep in mind and where I think it varies from different people, particularly as you did make a decision to change jobs or change careers, a lot of action that most people take is because of discomfort.
Yeah.
Some people may have a higher level of discomfort and the decision may not be to leave for you, where maybe your discomfort is 10% if I stay here. Yeah. That's enough maybe for me to keep. And it's not a judgment on, you should make this move or not. And for other people, you may not have this reach sort of what your discomfort level is to do. And you just kind of have to sort of assess that in what you're doing. The other thing, and I remember this was a book, I think it was called Decisions, and I forget the authors of it, but that's another thing that stuck out to me. There's also another path that this could have been. Let's just say I didn't have sort of a safety net that worked over years to do financially. We typically make that choice binary. Do I stay or do I go?
Yeah.
Well, this book was also encouraging you pushed for 3 more ideas.
Yeah.
Most people just stop and they make it so complicated. And so and I've done this numerous times, once you kind of push toward that like 4th, 5th, 6th idea, you start getting creative. Well, could I have worked at ONA halftime? Maybe not, but how do I know until I ask? Or
absolutely
what those options could have been.
Yeah. So when I teach managerial decision-making classes, one of the things that we talk about in the very beginning is often that decision and the word deciding actually comes from the Latin word for cutting off something with scissors, like scissor, cut off, which only means that you basically say, well, what I currently have is not exactly 100% fulfilling all the needs that I have. that does not mean you decide for something else. That the first and foremost thing is, well, there is something that I want to change about the current situation. But then it's about, like you said, creating that variety of options and kind of even accelerating, the diversity of options to then figure out, okay, that's maybe the next step. But I feel it's hard in reality. I feel it's hard just because you feel the stakes are so high. If you had a great job and a great leadership role, I mean, your own stakes are probably high, but it's also like you said, your surroundings are like, oh my God, he's the CEO. She's the chief product officer. She's the editor in chief. What's she going to do next?
Mm-hmm.
And I feel it's hard, even if as a person who does not care that much about, what people around you say, unless they are close family and friends. I think it's hard to kind of totally kind of stay in the zone and be like, I don't care. I'm going to make my own decision. Were you never tempted was it tempting to be like, not just in a decision to kind of change careers, but in general with people? I'm sure you had plenty of people giving you well-meant feedback on your leadership style, on your managerial decision-making, like all these things. Were you never tempted to be like, should I really? Are they maybe right?
Honestly, yes. I think, again, this is where it goes in sort of hindsight. And I will tell you, I have always been jealous of people. There are people, and you hear these stories all the time. I always knew at the age of 2 that I was going to do this thing. And there's this nice, beautiful arc of like the path they took there. You throw in a couple of risky moves, maybe a sad story here. And then there's this triumph story. I have always been the person that struggled to know that sort of endpoint. And so struggling to sort of know that endpoint at times, you do wonder when you're making these incremental decisions when someone says, oh, well, why would you do that? And what would you do? And what would happen? And again, it kind of goes back to that moment of you being outside of yourself, which I forget the advice here where it says, this is why you're always able to give friends good advice, because that you wouldn't apply to yourself. It's kind of being outside of, like, give yourself advice, which is helpful. And then again, ultimately kind of leaning into what I'll just refer to as discernment at this juncture of kind of trusting that. And also, again, for me, I literally, and this is kind of, I think, the quirks of myself, I play out my worst case strategy, like literally visualize my worst case strategy. And while this is not true of everyone, even in my worst case, I still had a lot of privilege and blessings in that worst case, right? And so that also, for me, makes me comfortable on some of these risky decisions. And I think the same applies both personally and sort of in organizationally as well, too, because everyone's not going to understand what you do and visions of what you have for leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are some things that as you reflect back on that time, specifically at ONA, but also your other roles that you had, what are some things that you learned about yourself as a leader in those 10 plus, 15 plus years?
I did not realize there was an inferiority that I was having the entire time and in my ascension through this industry, which I think is applicable to different situations. So in my specific case, if you notice in my background, I didn't say I worked in a newsroom. And there was always this thing, which I noticed, and I would see this play out multiple times. Somebody could have worked in a newsroom for like a month. But as soon as they said, oh, I used to work at, WG, whatever, or at the Times, it was like an instant credibility that I saw that like was exchanged with people multiple times. So for a long while, I thought my role was to be this not seen support, right? Because I don't have the credibility of actually being in the newsroom, of understanding what goes on here day to day. And so therefore, there was a worthiness that I think I was carrying around that I lacked. And then over time, and as I start to understand it, and I wasn't aware of this too, so it goes back to kind of being self-aware. But then toward the latter part, I realized what I viewed as sort of this unworthiness. Irving, you haven't been in a newsroom. You've been around thousands. Your entire career, you've been around thousands. You've talked to thousands of people. You've been in these conversations. You literally have this unique perspective of listening to thousands of people and connecting the threads of an industry together. And that is what clicked for me. And I think where I've kind of overlaid the overlap is that both still in the industry, whether my experience is unique, but I do think this industry has created spaces of exclusion where if you don't come from this sort of style or this sort of lateral way up and to a certain extent pedigree, right? You're different. You don't get that connection. And I think now we're kind of coming to this moment where we're seeing these sort of different perspectives. I'm also jealous of all the careers now, today's day and age, because when I was growing up, it's like you had to be a reporter, you worked in a small town, you worked your way up, and this is what you did. And now you're leading this charge too. There's like entrepreneurial endeavors, there's social, there's audience, there's business. There's such a diversity there. So I think one of the biggest lessons for me, and I think everyone has some of this in them, or the percentages, is there anything that, you have an inferiority about or sort of unworthiness about? And is there a way to sort of look at that? How do you look at that as a strength? And is it a strength?
That's such a good point and such a good reflection. What are some things that you learned? I'm sure you learned a lot about the things you're good at and you're naturally good at and the things you enjoy. What are some things that you learned about yourself where you're like, that does not come naturally to me, or that's something that I struggle with as a leader or as a manager, or that's something that I have to put an extra emphasis on to, stay focused or whatever it is?
I've flipped this a little bit now. And again, my evolution in not making things binary, I've kind of less referred to good and bad.
Yeah.
I think there's a baseline now. So anything toxic, abusive, clear levels of things that are inappropriate in any work environment, that we're just going to assume that that's a baseline. Yes. Above that, though, it gets subjective. The previous version of me, I am very much a coaching leader. By nature, I'm collaborative by nature. I think I was a catalyst when you do the whole Myers-Briggs thing. So by the very nature of my being, I bring people together, right, for the greater good of whatever that is. And so there was a time when I thought, and I've seen success with that. And there was a time where I thought, like, this is what a leader is supposed to be, and very critical of sort of former management styles and sort of top-down approaches. And I've now evolved to say, too much of anything is not good.
Yeah.
Right. So in my case, too collaborative is not great when you're in a time of fast decisions.
Yeah.
Like, and there are, again, I've kind of evolved. There are moments where as a leader, you make the call. This is what it is, right? Like, this is the decision. Everyone may not agree with it. We did not have sort of a meeting about it. And so that is the one piece of it. And I've also evolved to expand that to say whether it's good or bad is that similar to dating, there is a different person for each of us. And I don't think enough of us look at organizations like we look at our partners, where there is a match for you somewhere. And so certain organizations need certain leadership styles where, again, the top-down approach might work in an organization where folks are desperately looking for direction, right, in order. And so I've kind of evolved sort of the model of that to say, I best thrive in places that are on the forefront of innovation, very collaborative in nature, sort of get the DEI picture, not as successful in other places that might have a more aggressive need for a leader to be a little bit more kind of in that aggressive nature.
Absolutely. And that makes a ton of sense. And I do feel that sometimes when I see leadership careers falter or I see people become unhappy in a role is when the organization goes through a life cycle as well, right? And sometimes an organization might at some point need someone, who is way more focused on quiet, stable, organized operations rather than innovation and disruption, or an organization that has been in very, stable, quiet waters for many years might need someone to kind of wake it up from that beauty sleep and be like, okay, folks, we really need to, there is like a sense of urgency here to install. We really need to get going. And I think sometimes it's hard to, specifically when then, that's not your preferred like water temperature to swim in. Sometimes I feel it's like hard as a leader to then switch gears. And sometimes that's when I feel like, CEOs are being, kicked out in the media space or are being exchanged, or leadership teams are being kind of, 180-degree kind of turned around and exchanged, because I think it's just hard as a human being to kind of shift gears that much sometimes.
I think it's very, very hard to do. And the nature of the work that we do now is so dynamic. Anyone in a leadership role now, your work is so dynamic. I think one of the things that in a lot of leadership circles now, again, going back to those soft skills, a lot of leaders hadn't been boning up on that. And so they're pretty exhausted in terms of, I feel like I'm also a counselor and a therapist and all of these different things. And so I do think it goes back to that sort of intentionality of where so much of leadership has nothing to do with the other person. And your greatest gift is understanding yourself the best. Yeah. Because then you know how to adjust and alter how to lead people because you're spending the time invested in yourself. I think where I see this go wrong 100 times is when a leader is just completely unaware of not only other people on their team, but themselves as well. And then the organization is completely sort of always by the curtail adjusting to this sporadic style of a person.
Absolutely. So you mentioned before, let's assume that like toxicity and racism and sexism in organizations, that it's basically the bare minimum that we don't, support that or encourage that or even accept that as leaders. Now, I want to hear your assessment of the broader media industry, because while I would love to think that this bare minimum is a joint understanding across all kinds of organizations, tech organizations, news organizations, I sadly am not quite sure we are there yet. What is your assessment of the overall state of culture and leadership in the media space?
I think if you look at, and I'm coming from a U.S. lens on this right now, if you look at all the major cultural moments that have happened over the past several years, media was not immune to them and actually struggled to report on how the media was not immune to them. So I think your assessment is right. All the isms are there. They're still there. I think obviously there's a broader overlay of just the environment at large, the working environment. But I think all of the isms are there. And I think for leaders, this is a bit challenging where when I say leaders in this context, I think of people who are in the middle. Meaning you're reporting above, you're leading people as well. And so I think that's where you have seen a lot of people kind of struggle, both value-wise, moral-wise, a lot of kind of tough calls you have to make. But ultimately, and I do believe this, I don't think it's the size of the organization. It starts at the top. Like you're constantly sitting as a leader, every second is sending a signal of what's appropriate here and what culturally what happens here. And every non-action sends the same signal.
Absolutely. Do you think we lost that momentum that we kind of started to have after the murder of George Floyd, that momentum to really honestly, sincerely this time tackle DEIB and really take it seriously?
Yes. I think I don't want to say that I saw this coming. The issue that I saw and see and where leaders still today are struggling, it goes back to the environment. When the murder of George Floyd happened, the elevated conversations around DEI, I saw certain leaders treat this as just another strategy. There was no difference between what happened to George Floyd and AI right now. It's like what everybody's talking about. We got to get good at it. We have to, and the disconnect between understanding that what you see as a strategy is my entire lived experience hurts when you don't see that. As a person, it hurts. Yeah. And when you're working for people who don't get it, and then you have a double-edged sword because you as a leader not recognizing sort of the heavy emotional context that comes with DEI as a person of any sort of background, marginalized background, then add the work of strategy to it. And 9 times out of 10, you're giving people who are struggling with that the strategy of it. And now they're managing themselves, the strategy, and your incompetence. And so that's where I think we hit the ball. And so now you see sort of this curve. Again, ironically, I said AI. AI is what everyone's talking about. And then meanwhile, you sort of brought people on this emotional journey of thinking, hey, the world is going to be different. Work is a part of the world. The world is going to be different. Media is going to be different. And then it's like, oh, well, wait, now we have to focus on this, right? And so people are sort of left there. There are obviously efforts that have changed and people are doing stuff. But on the whole, I do think there was a larger moment that we missed.
Yeah. And do you feel that younger generations are a bit more, well, how should I say? I sometimes feel younger generations are a bit more angry about this or a bit more expressive about that, about, what they are not accepting anymore in the workplace, the expectations they have for respect and inclusion in a way. Is that a generational thing or?
It's a bit of both. I think, to be fair, I think it's a mindset. I think more of the mindset may be in a certain generation than others, but I think every sort of generation has this and the capabilities in it. To me, the answer is yes to that question. I also get perplexed. I'm in these rooms all the time where if I have another millennial, also millennials are old, by the way, just FYI. Millennials are old.
Totally. That's like us.
Gen X and millennials. They're old. They are going bald. So let's just not have that be the real. You can still say Gen Z, but millennials, it's not a thing anymore. People are perplexed by this, and to me, it's so obvious. You have generations that have grown up with previous generations that prioritized work and sacrificed a lot, whether that was their own personal endeavors, their own hobbies, their families. In the name of work under this contract, the social contract that we have, which is employment, and they're getting a cake. Thank you for your service. And they get a nice cake and a beautiful party, and then they're left to sort of live their lives that they haven't explored fully yet, sort of in sort of the latter years. And because they've created an identity around this, many struggle to know who they are beyond it. And I think you've had a generation that has grown up and said, thank you for that lesson. Thank you for what you've done to kind of pave this way. But I would like to explore who I am fully. And I would like to adjust this contract, this social contract, right? And so there are parts of me that you don't have access to 24/7. There are parts that work has been separate from the world, and we don't understand why, because we spend the large majority of our time here. So why is that second? And then they're just asking questions that the response is, well, it's always been like, or we don't question that, right? So I think, again, they're coming with this sort of fresh mindset. Now, I do think, like all things, too much of anything it's never a good thing. And I think this generation will come into their own sort of like where they land and settle on. But I think all the questions are valid. I think it's the sort of disruption that we need right now. And we're sort of in a moment where how we kind of talk through that is a little uncomfortable. But hopefully we get to a point where we kind of have a new way of work and exploring things.
Fully agree. We're sadly nearly at the end of our conversation. So I'd love to end with the same question that I ask all my guests at the end. If you could go back in time to young Irving and give yourself some advice about career, about life, about leadership, what would you tell yourself?
Oh my gosh, I should have listened to the other podcast and other questions. The first thing that comes to mind, which may sound weird, it's not that serious. I think the younger you, there's both equally time is forever and time is like short. Whatever you're focusing on, whether it's work, family, personal career, whatever, the magnitude of it when you're young feels very intense. And it feels like there's not rooms to make mistakes. So it's almost like I would tell my younger self, keep your intensity, but it's not that serious, right? Like figure out that balance.
That is fantastic advice. Thank you so much for being here with me today, Irving. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. This was fun.
This was today's episode of Better Leaders. If you enjoyed it, please do follow us and subscribe. Thanks for listening.
Missing Link